In this lesson, we'll begin the process of better integrating the buildings on our skyline into our developing scene. Okay, so this is where we left off in the last lesson. We had just done this color correction using a LUT profile here in Photoshop, a color lookup adjustment layer to be specific. So at this point, we've kind of come full circle on this project, and we're back to the buildings that we kind of started off with. So let's go ahead and zoom in and kind of look at these buildings, and really in their current state, they're really competing for attention in this image. In this image, we've got this really kind of surreal scene going, but then we've got these really bold buildings in the background that really kind of pop. Now, what I'd like to do here in these last few lessons is push them further into the background, as well as kind of to cap this course off, just add some kind of dramatic lighting and maybe some atmospheric elements into the scene. So with that said, what we need to do first is, again, think about our light source. We talked about it being to the right-hand corner up here at the top of our image. And it's actually going to be probably behind these buildings on the left. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Now, these buildings on the right, it's going to actually probably illuminate these front faces of these buildings. So we've got a couple of different things going here. Let's go ahead and handle the buildings on the left first. And, you know, I've separated them into groups here so we can kind of build off of these layers. So let's go ahead and first on these buildings on the left, let's go ahead and again right-click on this layer and convert it to a smart object. Now, the first thing we want to do is come in and blur these buildings out just a little bit. So right now, all the details are super, super crisp, but if there's atmosphere that's interfering with our vision on these buildings, then things are going to get a little bit more blurry. So we'll come up and add a Gaussian blur, sort of like this. And let's go ahead and, that's actually not bad, the current setting of 3.2. So let's go ahead and set that to something like 3 pixels, and we'll hit OK. All right, great. So now at this point, I'm going to come in and let's just collapse that. This indicates that we do have a smart filter applied. So and of course, this little icon indicates that it is a smart object. So above that, though, let's go ahead and add in a color fill adjustment layer. So we're going to come in and add a solid color fill layer, sort of like that. And I'm going to come in and choose kind of a dark brown color. Maybe something around in there to start with. Now, obviously, we can come in and change that at any time by double-clicking on that icon. We get right back to our color picker. Now, I don't want it to fill the entire sky, so let's go ahead and clip it to our smart object simply by holding down the Alt key and clicking in between those two layers. And I'm going to come in and change this over on the blend mode for this layer to multiply. Now, obviously, that's way, way too dark, so let's drop the opacity on that down pretty significantly, maybe somewhere around 80% or so for right now. Now, that covers sort of darkening up those faces that are away from the light source. But the next thing I'd like to do is affect the contrast over here. So let's go ahead and go with a brightness contrast adjustment layer. And I'm simply going to dial that contrast down here. And I'm going to dial that down quite a bit. Let's go to around, let's stop right about there. And if we come in and hide that, you can kind of see what kind of difference that's made. All right, great. So we've added our brightness contrast layer. We want to definitely clip that into this stack as well, so it's only affecting these buildings on the left. Now, I'm going to make a levels adjustment at this point. So we'll come in here and again add another adjustment layer for levels. And before we do anything, I'm going to come over here and just clip that again to our stack. So we're only affecting the buildings themselves. So now with this levels adjustment layer, what I want to do is our blacks are way, way too deep here. So I'm going to bring the blacks up so they're not near as dark simply by grabbing this slider right here and dialing that up. Now we're going to bring them up quite a bit too far, but we're going to utilize the mask for this adjustment layer. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to start to blow the whites out. I'm going to bring those down to maybe around 180 or so. Now that is, again, way, way too bright. Remember, this is the side away from our light source. So we can come in here and use this mask, let me just close this out. I've got my mask selected, and I'm going to come in here and let's select sort of a middle gray for our background color. So we've got sort of a black to middle gray, and we're going to want to grab our gradient tool. So let's come in here, and before we grab that, we'll make a selection. So I'm going to just make a selection with my rectangular marquee selection tool, and we'll just make a selection sort of like that. And let's come in, grab our gradient tool by hitting G on our keyboard. Now the gradient tool is the first one in this stack here, so if you see the paint bucket tool, then check above that and you'll find the gradient tool. So with that selected, you can see up here we've got a preview of what our gradient's going to look like. I'm going to go ahead and start to use this gradient to dump into my mask in this selection. I'm going to start to bring in a little bit more of those dark values here. So if we do that, that's quite a bit. Starting it off my canvas here. Let's take a look at that gradient. See, that's not quite what I'm looking for. So we'll undo that. Let's try coming in here and clicking on our foreground color and bringing that up from a black to maybe a dark gray, somewhere in here. Then we'll come in and drag that gradient across again. Now I'm holding Shift so I can draw a straight line with my gradient. I click on this one, and let's bring that gray up some. There we go. That's starting to look a little bit better here. Feel free to play with your gradient a little bit more if you'd like to. At this point, I'm going to come in and deselect that by hitting Control-D. And let me just show you what the gradient looks like. I'll Alt-click on my mask over here, and you can kind of see the gradient that I've applied. So basically, we've kind of pushed that building back into the background. If I hide all those adjustment layers, we'll go ahead and hide the blur as well. You can kind of see the difference that it's made. So those are a lot less crisp, and they are definitely kind of pushed back into the background some. So let's go ahead and look at the buildings on the right at this point. So these buildings are a little different, being that the light source is going to be sort of illuminating these buildings. So let's come in and work in our right-hand group here. We'll go ahead and first right-click and convert to Smart Object. And again, we're going to blur this out, similar to what we did with the buildings on the left. So we'll come in and add a Gaussian blur. And I'm going to go ahead and stick with about 3 pixels. Let's look and see what that looks like. Yeah, that's okay. Now, these buildings are awful detailed too. So you can see a lot of these windows, and we've got a lot of saturated colors here. So we're going to want to handle that as well. So now, the first thing I want to do is see if we can't give them a little bit of yellow coloration here. So we'll come in here and add in another solid color fill layer here. And I'm going to add sort of a beige color here. Maybe something around in there. And let's go ahead and set this particular color adjustment layer to something like overlay. That's pretty intense, so we want to definitely dial that back. Or maybe we could just come in here and desaturate that a little bit. I'll tell you what, let's handle the brightness contrast issue here. So let me hide that, and we'll dump in a brightness contrast adjustment layer. And with this adjustment layer, I'm going to dial both of those down quite a bit. Let's go ahead and dial that contrast down. Want to definitely clip this in. And I'm going to put it there. We'll dial the brightness down as well. Take that contrast down quite a bit. We'll work with that. So let's close that out and bring back in this particular layer here. Now, at this point, these buildings just don't seem to be affected by the hazy environment that we have them in here. So if you're familiar with buildings that have, cities that have giant buildings in them, on a hazy day, it's going to get harder and harder to see the tops of these buildings. So maybe we could come in here and use another mask to kind of fade out the buildings some. So let's go ahead and apply a mask here to the right group inside of buildings. I'll go ahead and apply a layer mask there, and we're again going to use our gradient tool. So let's go ahead and grab that over here in our tool panel, and let's go ahead and choose our colors again. Let's choose our background color here, and I'm just going to make that white. And I'm going to make this color here on our foreground a middle to light gray. Let's go ahead and start with that here. Now, we're going to go ahead and drag this across our screen here, moving from top to bottom. So we're going to start off, drag it down sort of like that. And you can see we're starting to sort of pull those buildings back up into the clouds a little bit there. So, with that said, I'm going to play probably with this gradient just a little bit more. And I also think I'd like to play with this color a little bit more. Maybe warm that up some, desaturate that a little bit more on our overlay solid color adjustment layer. So, but what I'd like to do in the next lesson is I'd like to spend one more lesson focusing on just the buildings in this scene. I think that one thing that also stands out to me in this scene is we've created all this carnage in the middle and the foreground, but really the buildings in the background seem relatively new and unscathed by this reclaiming of the city by nature. So let's go ahead and spend the next lesson just creating a little bit of damage and refinement on these buildings.